Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, classmates. I am Mika Castrense, and for today's video, I will be discussing The Adventure of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. So for the author's background, Mark Twain or Samuel Langhorne Clemens was an American writer, businessman, publisher, and lecturer. He rose through the ranks of American literature from his day job as a Mississippi River boat pilot. His work is both deeply serious and hilarious, ironic at the same time. His masterpiece is the novel of Huckleberry Finn, which is frequently referred to as the classic American novel. Mark Twain's many statements on politics and human nature are commonplace among speechmakers. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn have never lost their status as obligatory reading in schools, and they continue to serve as models for young adult fiction. Generation of American writers have been influenced by his writing style. All modern American literature originates from one novel by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. Ernest Hemingway stated in 1935. Mark Twain wrote several novels and short stories with writing that appealed to both common and intellectual readers during his lifetime. Because of his disdain for nobility and luxury, he became known as the people's author. During his lifetime, he was well known and taught in dozens of cities around the country, drawing big crowds. He was one of the first significant figures of the time to use modern technology, and he was friends with investors Thomas Edison. Many hilarious writers existed during Mark Twain's time, although they are largely forgotten today. Twain's humor has endured because the best kind of humor is serious. His joking goes to the roots of human nature. It is not dependent on the events of his lifetime, but like Shakespeare, Mark Twain's situations are universal, placing his characters in situations that have faced human beings since the beginning of time and will continue to do so. Simultaneously, he was preoccupied with the issues of his time, particularly slavery, which he addressed in the same way with what the point to universe ironies. The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn is the first significant American novel written entirely in the vernacular. It is recounted in the first person by Huck Finn, a friend of Tom Sawyer, and is distinguished by a local color regionalism. It is the sequel of Tom Sawyer's Adventure. It is known for its vivid portrayals of people and locations along the Mississippi River. Since its release, literary critics have continued to investigate the work. It was widely panned at its initial release due to its vulgar language, and it became much more devised in the 20th century due to its alleged use of racial stereotypes and frequent use of racial N-word, despite strong assertions that the protagonist and author an anti-racist. There have been editions that have replaced the N-word with the word slave, which has sparked debate. Huck's language becomes unrealistic as a result, and much of point of the books is lost. So here is the summary of the story, Tom Sawyer. An imaginative and mischievous boy named Tom Sawyer lives with his Aunt Polly and his half-brother Sid in the Mississippi River town of St. Petersburg, Missouri. After playing hooky from school on Friday and dirtying his clothes in a fight, Tom is made to whitewash the fence as punishment on Saturday. At first, Tom is disappointed by having to forfeit his day off. However, he soon cleverly persuades his friends to trade him small treasures for the privilege of doing his work. He trades these treasures for tickets given out in Sunday schools for memorizing Bible verses, and uses the ticket to claim a Bible as a prize. He loses much of his glory, however, when in response to a question to show off his knowledge, he incorrectly answers that the first two disciples were David and Goliath. Tom falls in love with Becky Thatcher, a new girl in town, and persuades her to get engaged to him. The romance collapses when she learns that Tom has been engaged before a girl named Amy Lawrence. Shortly after being shunned by Becky, Tom accompanies Huckleberry, the son of the town drunk, to the graveyard at night to try out a cure for warts. At the graveyard, they witness the murder of Dr. Robinson by the Native American half-breed Indian Scared. Tom and Huck run away and swear a blood oath to tell anyone that they have seen. Injun Joe blames his companion, Muff Potter, a hapless drunk, for the crime. Potter is wrongfully arrested and Tom's anxieties and guilt begin to grow. Tom, Huck, and Tom's friend Joe Harper run away to an island to become pirates. While frolicking around and enjoying their newfound freedom, the boys become aware that the community is sounding the river for their bodies. Tom sneaks back home one night to observe the commotion. After a brief moment of remorse of suffering of his loved ones, Tom is struck by the idea of appearing at his funeral and surprising everyone. He persuades Joe and Huck to do the same. They return and met with great rejoicing, and they become the envy and admiration of all their friends. Back in school, Tom gets himself back in Becky's favor after he nobly accepts the blame for a book that she has ripped. Soon, Muff Potter's trial begins and Tom, overcome by guilt, testifies against Injun Joe. Potter is acquitted, but Injun Joe flees the courtroom through a window. Summer arrives and Tom and Huck go hunting for buried treasure in a haunted house. After venturing upstairs, they hear a noise below. Peering through holes in the floor, they see Injun Joe enter the house disguised as a deaf and mute Spaniard. He and his companion, an unkept man, plan to bury some stolen treasure on their own. From their hiding spot, Tom and Huck wiggle with delight at the prospect of digging it up. By an amazing coincidence, Injun Joe and his partner find a buried box of gold themselves. When they see Tom and Huck's tools, they become suspicious that someone is sharing their hiding place and carry the gold off instead of reburying it. Huck begins to shadow Injun Joe every night, watching for an opportunity to nab the gold. Meanwhile, Tom goes on a picnic with McDougal's cave with Becky and their classmates. That same night, Huck sees Injun Joe and his partner making off with a box, and he follows and overhears their plans to attack the widow Douglas, a kind resident of St. Petersburg, by running to fetch help. Huck foretells the violence and become an anonymous hero. Tom and Becky get lost in the cave, and their absence is not discovered until the following morning. The men of the town begin to search for them, but no avail. Tom and Becky run out of the food and candles and begin to weaken. The horror of the situation increases when Tom, looking for a way out of the cave, happens upon Injun Joe, who is using the cave as a hideout. Eventually, just the searchers are giving up, Tom finds a way out. The town celebrates, and Becky's father, Judge Thatcher, locks up the cave. Injun Joe, trapped inside, starves to death. A week later, Tom takes Huck to the cave and they find the box of gold, the proceeds of which are invested for them. The widow Douglas adopts Huck, and when Huck's attempt to escape civilized life, Tom promises him that if he returns to the window, he can join Tom's robber band. Reluctantly, Huck agrees. So this is the literal meaning of the story Tom Sawyer. Well, everybody does it that way. Huck, Tom, I am not everybody. So this was a conversation by Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. This concept means being yourself. Another is that I could forgive the boy now if he'd committed a million sins, which was said by Tom Sawyer. This concept means forgiveness. While the connotative meaning of the story was the title character of Mark Twain's work, The Adventure of Tom Sawyer, is Thomas, Tom Sawyer. He also appears in 3 additional Twain novels, Huckleberry Finn's Adventure, Tom Sawyer's Abroad, and Tom Sawyer Detective, Huck and Tom Among the Indians, Schoolhouse Hill, and Tom Sawyer's Conspiracy are three unfinished Twain writings that feature Sawyer. While all three unfinished works were published after Twain's death, only Tom Sawyer's Conspiracy has a complete plot, as the other two were abandoned after only a few chapters. The name of the fictitious character may have been inspired by a joyous and flamboyant fireman named Tom Sawyer, whom Twain met while working as a correspondent for the San Francisco Call in San Francisco, California. Sam, he would listen to these pranks of mine with great pleasure, and he'd occasionally take them down in his notebook. Twain remarked of Sawyer, and one day he says to me, "I am going to put you between the covers of a book some of these days, Tom." "Go ahead, Sam, but don't disgrace my name." Twain claimed the character was inspired by three people later identified as John B. Briggs, William Bowen, and Twain. However, Twain later changes his story, claiming Sawyer was fully formed solely from his imagination. However, as Robert Gray Smith puts it, the great appropriator likes to pretend his characters sprang fully grown from his fertile mind. So next is the influence of Tom Sawyer in social, political, philosophical, historical, sociological, and authors' underpinnings. Tom is involved and often the organizer of juvenile pranks and make-believe games as the narrative begins. As the narrative progresses, these seemingly harmless children's games to take increasing importance. Tom puts himself, Joe Harper, Huck, and Becky Thatcher, who is trapped in the cave, in increasing risky positions. He also finds himself in situations where he must choose the welfare of others over his own, such as when he accepts Becky's punishment and testifies during Injun Joe's trial. Tom's maturity, ability, and moral integrity grow as he takes the initiative to help others rather than himself. Tom's trips to Jackson's Island and McDougall's Cave whisk him away from civilization. The symbolic detections assist him prepare to return to the village with a new, more mature perspective on his community's relationship with him. Tom looks up to Huck at first because is older and wiser, but by the end of the book, Tom's maturity has surpassed Huck's. Tom's personal progress is seen in his demand and Huck's stay with the widows Douglas and become civilized despite Huck's desire to avoid all societal limitations. Outsiders are easily detected in St. Petersburg, which is a close community. Huck Finn, who fends for him outside of any family structure since his father is an alcoholic, Muff Potter, who is also a drinker, and Injun Joe, a hostile half-breed, are among the most noteworthy local outsiders. Despite its evident division of outsiders and insiders, the group appears to have a great desire to be inclusive. Even though he lives on the outskirts of society, the town tolerates the alcoholism of a harmless rascal like Muff Potter, and Huck is more or less protected. Tom, like the other orphans, has been taken by Aunt Polly out of love and filial piety. Injun Joe is the only person in St. Petersburg who is fully cut off from society. Only after Injun Joe's death are the town people able to turn him into a decent member of his St. Petersburg society in manipulating his memory. The story also uses different literary devices such as anaphora, allusion, foreshadowing, hyperbole, imagery, metaphor, personification, and simile. So, The Adventure of Tom Sawyer has three themes. The main themes in The Adventure of Tom Sawyer are friendship, imagination, truth, and falsehood. Friendship, because the friendship between Tom, Joe, and Huck allows them to construct their own adventurous world. They fight in one another, enables them to overcome challenges and have fun whenever they go. While imagination, because Tom's creativity helps him to escape many of the constraints of adult life, and he and his pals see the world in his way that adults cannot. Truth and falsehood, because despite his nefarious character, Tom's conscience prompts him to confess the truth after vanishing and to assist Muff Potter in avoiding false prosecution. So that's the end of my report. Thank you for listening.